The night was cloaked in silver silence when Sheikh Hamdan sat before the open window, the velvet curtains swaying softly with the desert wind. Beyond the palace walls, the city shimmered like a crown of light upon the earth, but within those walls, the air was heavy with something unspoken. His pen hovered above the paper, his thoughts spiraling between duty and desire. For years, he had spoken to the world through poetry, yet tonight, his words were not for the public, they were a confession. A voice rising quietly behind the veil of royalty, where even kings must face the echo of their own hearts. To the world, Fazza was a man of legend, an icon of grace, courage, and poetic soul. But beneath the glimmer of power lived a heart that carried stories too fragile for the throne. Every smile he wore was touched by a quiet restraint, every verse he shared only half of what he truly felt. There were poems he never recited aloud, words he folded away in the secrecy of ink-stained paper, afraid they might expose too much of the man beneath the title. Tonight, though, the walls between poetry and truth began to dissolve. He was no longer writing for the world, he was writing to free himself. His confession was not of weakness, but of humanness. Even royalty, he wrote, bleeds when the heart remembers. His pen moved like a whisper, like a prayer breaking through silence. The verses spoke of the weight of expectations, of the way his heart had learned to hide behind his own legend. They spoke of love that could never be spoken, of nights when he longed to be only a poet, not a prince, not a symbol, just a man chasing the horizon with his words. Every line he wrote pulled away another layer of armor until only his soul remained, raw and luminous. He thought of the people who saw him only through the golden lens of grandeur, never imagining the solitude behind the smile. They saw the writer, not the dreamer. They heard his voice in celebrations, but never in sorrow. And so, he wrote for the first time not as Fazza, the poet of nations, but as Hamdan, the man who whispered his heart to the stars. Behind the veil of royalty, he wrote, "My voice trembles like any other. It sings not of power, but of peace, not of conquest, but of connection." These were not the words of a ruler. They were the sighs of a soul longing to be heard. Outside, the desert wind carried his words through the open window, scattering them like petals across the night. The dunes seemed to listen, their golden curves glimmering under the moonlight as though they understood. They had always been his silent companions, the only witnesses to the tears he never let the world see. To them, he confessed freely, knowing the sand would keep his secrets. He wrote of lost love, of promises unspoken, of the loneliness that lingers even in a palace filled with people. Each verse was a pulse, a truth that refused to remain buried. He remembered the moment he first fell in love with words, not for fame, but for freedom. Poetry had been his refuge, the only space where he could exist without boundaries. Yet even poetry had become a mask, a beautiful one, but still a mask. Tonight, he tore it away. The man who once wrote about the beauty of love now wrote about the cost of it. Love, he confessed, is not always a blessing. It is sometimes a quiet exile. His ink trembled across the page as though afraid of what it was revealing, but he did not stop. Truth had waited too long for its turn to speak. There was one memory that haunted him, the face of the woman who once taught him how silence could speak louder than words. She was not a queen, not of rank or title, but her presence had ruled his heart without effort. He had written countless poems inspired by her, yet none dared to say her name. In this confession, he finally allowed himself to remember her fully, the laughter, the grace, the way she looked at him not as a prince, but as a man. "You," he wrote, "were the only one who saw through the veil." As dawn began to break, the golden light touched the ink still drying on the paper. The words glowed like fire, his heart, finally set free. He had not written for an audience, he had written for release. His confession was not meant to scandalize the world, but to remind it that even those born into crowns are bound by the same longing, to be seen, to be understood, to be loved beyond the image.
He gathered the pages and placed them in a wooden box carved with verses of hope. No one would ever read them. They were not written to be seen, they were written to be lived. The box would remain in his chamber, unseen by the world but guarded by his spirit. It was not a collection of poems, it was a mirror. A reflection of the man beneath the veil of royalty, the man who dared to confess through verse what speech could never carry. Outside, the city awoke slowly, unaware that its prince had spent the night shedding his soul upon the page. The call to prayer echoed softly in the distance, and Sheikh Hamdan smiled faintly, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He felt renewed, as though the confession had cleansed something deeper than sorrow, it had purified his truth. He realized that the greatest power a man can have is not to rule others, but to understand himself. When he stepped out onto the balcony, the first rays of sunlight brushed against his face, warm and forgiving. He whispered to the horizon, "Let my silence speak where my words could not." It was a promise, not to the world, but to himself, to live more truthfully, to write more bravely, to lead with compassion that came from understanding the fragility of the human heart. The wind answered him softly, carrying his vow into the golden distance. From that day forward, whenever he wrote, the tone of his poetry changed. The verses became more honest, more luminous, touched by something divine. The world continued to adore Fazza, the poet of passion and wisdom, but only he knew that every new line was a continuation of that secret confession. Each poem carried a heartbeat from that night, each word a piece of his unveiled soul. And so, beneath Dubai's radiant skies, the legend of Fazza grew, not merely as a prince or a poet, but as a man who dared to let his heart speak behind the veil. His confession in verse became the unseen crown upon his spirit, a silent anthem of truth. And though no one would ever read the pages he wrote that night, their essence lived on in every poem he shared thereafter, a voice once hidden, now eternal, echoing softly through time. The night after his confession, Sheikh Hamdan found himself standing again where the moon kissed the horizon, the ink of his thoughts still alive in his veins. The palace was asleep, yet his heart remained wide awake, caught between the hush of serenity and the echo of everything he had finally admitted to himself. The veil had lifted, and though no one had seen it fall, he felt its absence like the first breath after drowning. His words had freed him, but freedom, he realized, is never without consequence. It changes how one sees everything, the world, the self, and love itself. He began to walk through the long marble corridors, his footsteps faint beneath the towering arches. The portraits of ancestors gazed down upon him, their eyes carved with both pride and caution. For centuries,